I just wanted to welcome everyone who's joining us today from across the Philippines, the UK and Australia, and the many lands that you're joining us from. My name is Lena Nahlous and I'm the CEO of Diversity Arts Australia. I'm a middle-aged Arab woman. I have light olive skin, dark brown hair with some greys, and I'm currently wearing a caramel top and I'm wearing black rimmed glasses. If anyone wants to turn captions on, you can go to the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on Show Captions. And this session is being interpreted by Yasmin Dandachi and Dima El Alam. I wanted to start by acknowledging on behalf of Diversity Arts Australia, the First Peoples of these lands that I'm joining you from today, the lands of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation, and pay respects to elders past and present and recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd also like to extend that respect to all of the elders on the lands that you're joining us from today and for other First Peoples joining this session within Australia and across the world. Please feel free to write the lands that you're joining us on from in the chat. For those who don't know, Diversity Arts Australia is Australia's national voice for ethnocultural and migrant racial equity in the arts, screen and creative sectors, and we work in partnership and solidarity with other social movements and other communities. Our work is guided by a human rights ethic and social justice principles, and we strongly believe that embracing a diverse range of creative expressions and participation is essential for fostering a democratic, inclusive and sustainable creative sector and society. Our relationship to the Imagine Around the World project came from our work on the Creative Equity Toolkit, and Aisha Mahmood, who's doing tech today and is one of our wonderful research assistants, will pop in the link to the Creative Equity Toolkit, and we'll be sharing a little video on that very soon. The Imagine case studies, so we've got this amazing toolkit that we're going to introduce you to, and the Imagine case studies came from this idea that we wanted to kind of capture leading work in racial equity and share this in a way that was accessible and practical with other organisations and individuals. And it also came from a place of decentering quite often, I guess, the West. And so the project has collected 71 case studies from 43 countries from around the world. And most of those case studies are, and 13 First Nations led local case studies as well. So there's a lot of very practical, useful information in those case studies that is designed to be kind of practical and actionable for other people to be able to kind of take it and say, oh, I can do this. This is how we created this, or we can develop, you know, we can work better with community this way because this is how this organisation did it. So we'll also pop a link into Imagine now. And I wanted to acknowledge that the Imagine project and Creative Equity Toolkits have received funding from our partners, British Council Australia, Creative Australia, Create New South Wales, Creative Victoria. So we're now going to show a little video about the Creative Equity Toolkit.
Right now, a lot of people are asking, what actions can I take for racial equity? That's the exact question that the Creative Equity Toolkit sets out to answer. So let's take a look. The website is organised around calls to action. So here in policy, for example, we have develop an equity and inclusion policy. There's some info on how to do this, followed by links to colour-coded resources. Links to templates and worksheets are pink, the case studies are green, and the research and reports are orange. For each resource link, there's a little explanation of what you'll find if you click through and an indication of the time commitment. So here, for example, there's a case study about the exercise game Zombies Run and the process they use to hire diverse scriptwriters for their next script. You can read their blog post about it. If you click on this pink link, you reach the Creative Diversity Network's Equality and Diversity Policy template, which you can then adapt to your needs. Under anti-racism, we have the action Educate Yourself. Here we have Ibram X. Kendi introducing his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and we have the UK's Rennie Edo-Lodge on her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. There's also a powerful search function. And to start with, we have 4 topics: anti-racism, cultural consultation, programming and commissioning, and policy. We'll soon be expanding to cover another 6 topics. I'm Monique Choi, project producer and lead writer on the Creative Equity Toolkit, which you can find at creativeequitytoolkit.org.
Thanks, Aisha, for showing that. We actually have 10 sections now of the Creative Equity Toolkit and growing. So really encourage you to spend some time and check that out, and also the Imagine case studies on which these wonderful talks are based, and which you'll hear a little bit more about in a minute. I wanted to hand over now to our host, our talk host, and our event partner, Dr. Sukhmani Khorana, who is a Scientia Associate Professor in the School of Arts and Media at the University of New South Wales. She's interested in media and migration, and her research focuses on multi-platform refugee narratives, the politics of food, the role of emotions in social change, cultural diversity in media and culture, and self-representation by young people of colour. Through her research, Sukhmani aims to create broader awareness about the lives of asylum seekers and refugees, and contribute to capacity building of disadvantaged migrant communities. She's the author of 2 books, co-editor of 2 edited collections, and has published dozens of academic and non-academic articles. So over to you, Sukhmani.
Thank you so much, Lena, for that kind introduction. And I also should flag that I have worked on the Imagine case studies, a couple of the Imagine case studies several years ago. So it's good to have that kind of ongoing connection with the project. So welcome, everyone. Before we begin today, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting. For me, that is the Darug people in Western Sydney, and also work on Bidjigal lands in Eastern Sydney, where UNSW is located. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this is and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Now, since this is an online session, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which you were all based, whether it's here in Australia or it's overseas. Now, for today's talk, which is titled Anti-Racism, Empowering Change Through Art and Culture, I'm going to begin by introducing a short video from Anna Hay, who's of British Council Australia, which is an organization that did also fund the Imagine project. So over to you, Aisha, to play the Imagine video.
Hello, I'm Anna Hay from the British Council in Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm living and working on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. We're proud to be working alongside Diversity Arts Australia as key partners in the Creative Equity Toolkit and its Imagine Case Studies project, a vital initiative under the Toolkit's umbrella. Here at the British Council, we build connections, understanding and trust between people in the UK and countries worldwide. The British Council and Diversity Arts Australia recognise the need for the Creative Equity Toolkit as a resource to share best practice in equity, anti-racism and inclusion within the arts, screen and creative sectors. Although we have very different contexts, the UK and Australia share similar barriers, and we hope that these conversations and case studies will create connections, share knowledge, and support organisations and individuals in their work towards equity. The Imagine project within the Creative Equity Toolkit has identified groundbreaking initiatives promoting cultural diversity and racial equity in the creative sectors. To date, the project has collected 71 case studies from the UK and around the world, including 13 focused on local First Nations, alongside 42 international case studies. These studies showcase outstanding stories of cultural equity.
Great, so that's an overview of the case studies. I'd like to say a few things about cultural safety before introducing our panelists today. So we have 3 speakers from the Philippines, Australia, and the UK who will discuss the work of their organizations and their fantastic initiatives using literature, art, theatre, and history to combat racism by promoting equity, diversity, and cultural empowerment. These panelists champion Indigenous expressions, they challenge societal norms, and celebrate the rich heritage of marginalized artists and communities, inspiring change and fostering understanding in society. We really hope that today's session will be informative for all of you. The main way that you can contribute to today's conversation is you can ask questions using the chat function. You can enter questions as they arise for you, but we will only be able to get to them towards the end, and we will try our best to get to as many as possible, but it really depends on time, but we are reserving about 5 or 10 minutes at the end for audience questions. This session is also being recorded, and it will be shared when it's ready via the Diversity Arts Australia's website. Lena has already introduced our wonderful interpreters. Just letting you know that you can also turn on live captions in the Zoom window by toggling on and off the CC button at the bottom of your screen. If by any chance you fall off and you can't get back in, the Zoom link is in the email that you received when you registered. Today's session will run for approximately 90 minutes, and we want this to be a useful and positive session, so we hope that everyone that's participating agrees to the following values that will guide the discussion. And the values are respectful, professional, and genuine engagement, deep listening, openness, non-judgment, and safety. Now, if at any time during this conversation you're finding the discussions difficult or stressful, you're very welcome to take a break and come back. Now, we encourage the audience members to keep the cameras and microphones off till the very end, and the speakers to obviously keep the cameras and microphones on when you're talking. I would first of all like to introduce our first panelist, Kristian Cordero, who's the founder of the Savage Mind Bookshop and Kamarin Art Gallery in the Philippines. Now, Kristian is a poet, a fictionalist, translator, and filmmaker based in the Bicol region. In 2017, he represented the Philippines in the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. Consequently, he was also appointed artist in residence by the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor in 2018. And in 2022 at the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study in South Africa. In 2019, he received the Southeast Asian Writers' Prize in Bangkok, Thailand from the Thai monarchy. And he serves as the director of the Ateneo de Naga University Press and runs an independent bookshop and art space called The Savage Mind. The bookshop has been called the creative heart of Bicol, a bastion of free thinking and the soul of a community. Now over to Kristian for his spotlight.
Thank you, Sukhmani. I'd like to greet everyone who are here, and let me begin my presentation. Do we have the slides ready, please? Thank you. Next slide. In the Bicol region, the southern peninsula of Luzon, we have the indigenous population known as the Agta, or oftentimes referred as kulot or kinky-haired, as opposed to someone like me who is identified as unat or straight-haired person. Next slides. For us Bicolanos, the Agta have always been our immediate other, the mysterious, dark, mischievous, untrustworthy, cunning, untamable, the eternal outsider. Our colonial histories are replete with documentation that casts these lights or this darkness towards them. Through the years, they have been subjects of ethnographic representations and studies, sometimes epistemologically tragic and violent. They join our harvest festivals as cultural tokens. They accept menial and domestic jobs for lowlanders. The Philippine government has recognized them by instituting a bureaucratic agency known as the National Commission for Indigenous People. As a child growing up in Iriga, I have always been attracted to them because of the produce they would bring from the mountains, food that has always been my source of comfort. Bamboo shoots, river clams, wild ferns, coconut, honey. I would see them in the market, and I was given the strong admonition from my elders never to look into their eyes unless I would like to be turned into an agta myself. Looking back, this left a strong impression on me. I particularly remember this story I first read in an article written by the journalist Juan Escandor for the Philippine Daily Inquirer. This is the case of Salvacion Buenaflor, which would always remind me why we must continue to tell our stories and frame it, refract it within the context of our immediate other. Salvacion admitted resenting the fact of being an agta. This fact was confirmed by his father when she confronted her about their being agta. Interestingly, Buenaflor learned about her being agta when she enrolled in a public elementary school in the town. There she received and endured the sneers and taunts from her classmates. One afternoon, when she was in grade 2, Salvacion decided to end the discrimination she was receiving by cutting one of her fingers in front of her non-agta classmates to show them her blood was red. She challenged them to also cut their fingers, stating that if their blood was red, then they too were agta. This story I carry within me, and I have been challenged to locate the narratives of these people and to cast a new way of understanding. In the many times I endeavored to reckon with my identity as a Bicolano and as a Filipino, the image of the indigene has taken my imagination like a specter, always prowling and probing my sense of ontology, my sense of history. Next slide. In my poetry and in the kind of cinema I endeavor to do, I involve the narratives of the agta to induct conversation and discussions that will allow them to speak and narrate their stories. Next slide. Next slide. And has always been one of the guiding principles with Savage Mind, the independent and community bookshop we established in 2018. Next slide. This is how it looks like now. As a bookshop, next slide, we are guided by the 3 E's as areas of engagement: educational, ecumenical, and ecological. We would like to continue to engage our communities, from children to senior citizens, from the indigenous population to Filipino creatives living in the diaspora, from people of different political and religious persuasions. Next slide. In 2021, next slide, we expanded the space by opening Kamarin, a space dedicated to highlighting the works of agta sculptors we had the chance to meet in 2020 when we did an art workshop and relief operation in the parish of Our Lady of Solitude in Tambo, Buhi, Camarines Sur. Next slide. This is the art space, the extension of the bookshop. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. These sculptural works made by the agta of Buhi revolve around the themes of folk narratives, the flora and fauna, and the Catholic religious iconographies, are continuing subjects that we are covering in a new documentary feature co-produced with the archaeologist Stephen Acabado and the University of California, Los Angeles. Next slide. Mga nakabuhing agi-agi, found objects, freed stories, weave the connection of the town's historical and folk accounts and that of the agta communities who survived in 2018 after a massive landslide occurred in the area due to a typhoon. In these forest debris, they gathered with their parish priests in the actual site of the landslides. They sculpted their stories of struggles, faith, and hope. They relive the narratives of tender love and devotion, their memory of vanished life forms that used to populate their mountains and lake. Next slide. Their aspirations for healing a bruised landscape. Next slide. It might be worth noting that the saga of the Agta people and us, the Bicolanos, continue to be written and documented. And where historical accounts fail, it may be our challenge, the creatives and the artists and the scholars, to re-examine our shared genealogies with the Agta, to look into their philosophies as a wellspring of indigenous knowledge and cultural values as exemplified by Nay Berta. Next slide. To render our faith that seeks justice, so that we may become what Gabriel Garcia Marquez said, the inventor of tales who will believe anything, feel anything, feel entitled to believe that it is not yet too late to engage in the creation of an opposite utopia, a new and sweeping utopia of life, where there is no one will decide for others how they die, where love will prove true and happiness be possible, and where races condemned to 100 years of solitude will have at last and forever a second opportunity on earth. Jos Mabalos, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kristian, for that beautiful story and what looks like a great initiative in that bookshop. I'll definitely visit if I ever get a chance to go to the Philippines. Thank you. So now I would like to introduce Lisa Anderson, who is from the Black Cultural Archives in the UK, which is a national organization based in Windrush Square in the heart of Brixton in London. Black Cultural Archives was founded in 1981 to collect, preserve, and celebrate the histories of people of African and Caribbean descent, to strengthen individuals, communities, and societies at large, building on an informal history of social activism over 4 decades. Lisa is a leader in the culture and heritage sector, passionate about visual arts and dance. With a background in human rights, she uses culture to champion social justice and racial equity. Since 2021, she has been the managing director at the Black Cultural Archives, promoting Black British history. As an independent curator, she advocates for African diaspora art, having established Black British art in 2016. In 2019, she launched an art advisory service and recently curated Soulscapes for Dulwich Picture Gallery. Lisa contributes to academic dialogue on arts, culture, and heritage, and advises Ates Fine Art and Uchenna Dance. Over to you, Lisa, for your spotlight.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and I'm still in the effects of that really moving presentation from Kristian. But it's a real honor to be here with you all across the globe. This is one of the benefits of working in culture at this level, that you get to have engaging, progressive conversation that can really release the power of culture for our shared visions of freedom and justice. So on that note, can you please pull up my slides? So here is a picture of the outside of Black Cultural Archives. As was said in the introduction, we are located in a historic location in London. We are in the heart of Brixton, which is quite synonymous with an important story around Black culture, Black communities in the United Kingdom. Brixton in South London is very much associated with the post-war migration of people of African heritage from the Caribbean, who saw the UK as their motherland, given its inclusion within the Commonwealth. So many people from islands across the Caribbean came to the UK in pursuit of opportunities to better their lives, and also in response to the call to support post-war development of the United Kingdom. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Windrush generation, but this is also a term associated with this period of migration that started around 1948 to 1972. A significant number of people from that movement ended up in South London and in Brixton, which became something of a symbolic and cultural home for that historic era of Black community building. So to have this home at 1 Windrush Square in this fine 3-level Georgian building is a very significant achievement. And we like to think of ourselves as the organisation as the home of Black British history. It has been created as a space that can be welcoming for the celebration and preservation and documentation of Black history. Next slide, please. Next. So we are the only national heritage centre dedicated to Black British history that is community-led. And what we mean by that is we are led by people who are from the community, the Black community. As I say, the Black community, we all hopefully may understand that there's always slippages around what that means. It is by no means a simple thing to define. It is a complex notion, but we speak of it as a community determined by people of African descent, some African heritage. And yeah, this organisation is dedicated to Black British history. Next slide, please. We were founded by somebody who is of the Windrush generation, was of the generation. As you can see him on the left-hand side, his name is Len Garrison. Came over to the United Kingdom at the age of 11 with his family, and very much went through all the challenges and navigated all the opportunities that is very synonymous with that time. When Len Garrison arrived, much like many others, we were still dealing with significant racist rhetoric in the political realm. There was racism in people's experience of housing and education. And in response to that, Len Garrison, who had an ardent passion for the power of knowledge, for empowerment, an interest in history and education, decided to create the African Caribbean Educational Resource Project. And this mobilized in a time where other Black parents and community organizations were also mobilizing the importance of education, specifically around Black history for community empowerment. Next slide, please. So here we are looking at slides that show that that mobilization wasn't a passive one, very much seated in the practices of community activism. And the archives is the manifestation of a dream to have a space where that education can be delivered, that empowerment can be realized. Next slide, please. So we've had different iterations of the building. Top left is the first building where I discovered Black Cultural Archives as a fresh graduate in human rights over 20 years ago. We then went down to the bottom left and then finally ended up on the larger image at 1 Moondrush Square 10 years ago this July. Next slide. So what is our mission? It is to collect, preserve, and celebrate the histories of people of African and Caribbean descent, but it's in order to give strength and power and inspiration to individuals, community, and society. What I think is really important to make explicit, though, is this is undergirded by a commitment to repair, a repair of the dismissal, obfuscation of knowledge and history that represents the contributions of people of the African diaspora. And as a result of that, Black Cultural Archives' mission is very much seated within a philosophy of reparative justice. Next slide, please. So our priorities are strengthening our archives, developing a world-class program, but also using the resources within our archives as a means to advocate for social justice for the communities we represent. And obviously, as any MD will tell you, financial resilience is also a key, and we'll get to that, I think, later in our conversation. Next slide, please. So we have 3 programmatic streams that fulfill on our mission. The first is collect and activate, and that really speaks to the core work of making the rich resources of collections that we house and steward at the archives and beyond in some very large storage spaces, how we make that available to our core audience, who are researchers from across the academic realm, as well as lay researchers from the community, activists who want to be, especially younger activists who want to be inspired by what has gone before them, as well as culture makers, authors, poets, journalists, filmmakers. What I love to talk about is the fact that Black Cultural Archives is something of a cultural engine, a knowledge production engine for society that is crucial, that has helped to transform scholarship across the board, but particularly on Black history. Next slide, please.
I'm super sorry to interrupt you, Lisa, but I'm super interested to hear about this work, but we will have to wrap up the spotlight as soon as we get a chance. We can definitely speak to all of this in the questions in the panel, so it's not, yeah.
That's fine. I will conclude by saying, if you just go to the next slide, our second programmatic stream is Educate and Inspire, which speaks to our educational program. Next slide. All right, you saw a little glimpse of babies' faces and different ages. There you go, people learning. Next slide is the final one. And the last one is Celebrate and Champion, which really speaks to our program of exhibitions and events that bring those stories to life in a more creative and innovative way for those people who don't want to go into a silent room and research. Okay, I'll leave it there for now, but thank you all for your patience. I look forward to the conversations that follow.
My sincere apologies for cutting that short, but I just thought that could come out in the questions a little bit later, because it's very relevant to the conversation that we are planning to have. And I'm also super inspired in thinking about many of us who work in or have been inspired by Black cultural studies, including for me, the kind of the birthplace was Brixton. So it was great to see that, in a way that I haven't really seen in Australia before. So thank you, Lisa. All right, so now I would like to introduce our third speaker, Görkem Acaroğlu, who's the artistic director of Metanoia Theatre, which is a really fantastic artist-led company that creates and directs theatrical and performance experiences that are diverse in both form and perspective. Görkem is a theatre director and an interdisciplinary artist with 25 years experience making innovative, socially engaged theatre across forms including documentary and digital performance, live art, immersive, and site-specific theatre. She was the creative director of Melbourne Workers Theatre, and in 2013, her company, Metanoia Theatre, transformed a local Melbourne community hall into a vibrant theatre and performance space. She has a long commitment to working with artists from culturally diverse backgrounds. So over to you, Görkem.
Thanks so much. And it's so wonderful to be here with Lisa and Kristian, and I look forward to the conversation. I'm just going to share some slides. Just give me a moment. So Metanoia Theatre is an independent artist-led company based in Victoria in Australia, and it was formed in 2013. And it privileges the work and perspectives of artists from racialised backgrounds in Australia. It came together in 2013 when a local council in Melbourne, in Victoria, offered a theatre. It was a theatre, a community hall used a lot by amateur theatre groups. The council wanted this to be turned into a contemporary art space. So I brought together two partners and we formed Metanoia Theatre in order to do that task. All of my personal work as a theatre director until that point had been, as I said earlier, privileging and working with artists from diverse backgrounds, from migrant backgrounds, also First People, and really focusing on different perspectives from the mainstream. I just wanted to quickly show you, this is unfortunately some old statistics, but this is from 2016. But Australia obviously is a very culturally diverse place. In 2016, these are some of the statistics, but you can see that then 39% of Australia's population were culturally linguistically diverse, and that's even more at the moment in the last census. But during the time that we formed Metanoia Theatre, unfortunately, our theatres didn't represent this in our population. So a lot of the theatre companies in Australia, the government-funded, government-subsidised companies, didn't represent the population. Most of the artistic directors, the administrators, the directors, the writers, and mostly the actors were representing the white Anglo-Celtic perspective of Australian population. So at the time that we formed, we were one of the few companies that was privileging artists from these backgrounds, was run by a racialized artistic director, and also we were one of the few companies, I'd say in the whole country, that is artist-led, independent, and was running a venue. So running a venue was, I cannot emphasize the point enough, and probably talk about this a bit more later, this most unusual opportunity for a company to be able to have a venue and the funds to pay an administrator enabled us to generate an income, which meant that we were largely independent of the strictures of government funding. And we could offer to audiences what we thought they'd be interested in, which was much more diverse perspective of an Australia, and we felt that we really, our one administrator was really enough to manage all of the administrative needs of an artist-led theatre company and a venue, and we didn't really want to get ourselves into the strictures of having to deal with all of the administration that's required with having a funding partner. So at the time that we worked at the venue, we provided opportunities for artists that were usually not given opportunities elsewhere. So for example, in Australia's theatre training schools, actor training schools, you do have, and back then, over a decade ago, a number of people who would come through who are of racialized backgrounds. But they would often be told that they would never be given lead roles in, the mainstream Australian theatre or television or film world. They would be given more minor roles. So we worked a lot with these younger artists who came straight out of theatre school, and we gave them lead roles, and we also supported them a lot to create their own work. And people that we worked with went on to become artistic directors of other companies, to get lead roles in a number of other productions, so as well as film and television. We also gave space grants to a lot of new theatre companies that were also artists from diverse backgrounds. And this was a really great way for people to be able to create new and experimental work that they couldn't necessarily get funded or create elsewhere. We also, in our own work that we presented, we were casting, you know, we were able to work with a whole range of artists and create our own casting rules. So we would cast, you know, such classic plays as Three Sisters with family. These are the three sisters. So three sisters from very diverse backgrounds. This is a production called A Mission of the Coleman Family, also was a family. And the people in that family came from all sorts of racialized backgrounds. And because we're working in theatre, we're working with the magic if. We believe that you don't have to be true to life in terms of these things. So our casting was always about privileging the artists, as I said, from diverse backgrounds. We were also able to experiment with form to create immersive and site-specific works in this venue. And it was really just amazing to have real estate. It was an immense benefit to an artist-led company to have, especially one that privileges the work of and perspectives of artists from diverse backgrounds. Unfortunately, though, sorry, I'll leave it on this slide. Actually, I might turn the slides off just for a moment and just say that unfortunately we were a bit too successful, and we ended up not continuing our contract with. So after the 4 years of our tender, the tender was put out again, and there was a lot of interest in the venue from companies and festivals and so on that prior to our being there hadn't known about this venue. And so the council did give it to a festival that unfortunately turned it into a development space and really undermined the 4 years of work we'd done to make it into a presentation space for diverse artists. So now we've moved to the regions. We live and work in the regions of Victoria, and we make work still here with the same focus. But now our work is mainly in non-theatrical sites. So if I can share this last slide, this is our one of our recent works, which was in a museum, a colonial museum, and it was really about the stories that are left out of the mainstream narrative of Australia's story of about how it was established. Thank you. I will leave it there.
Thank you, Görkem. That was very inspiring, and it's good to see a kind of representation, interpretation that's just about not necessarily reflecting reality, but about saying it is the artist's prerogative, and you can have racialized theatre production. So it's really great to see that kind of innovation, and also the interdisciplinarity of your work. So moving now on to the panel discussion section, for which we have about 35 minutes at best. I think maybe I'd like to start with, because Kristian and Lisa, a lot of your work is around scholarship and archiving, but also, the involvement of community in that process. So is there an interdisciplinary dimension to the work or any of the initiatives that you're involved in? And then maybe, Görkem, I'll get you to answer that question. Kristian, maybe we can go in the order that we have the spotlights in. Kristian and then Lisa and then Görkem. Is there an element of interdisciplinary collaboration in any of your work or your organization's work?
Certainly the interdisciplinarity of one's work has to be visible, has to be present. And I'd like to invoke the Filipino word daog palad, which means one puts his palm with the palm of the other to signify that our lines are now connected. This is a good image for interdisciplinarity. This is the same thing that we are trying to cultivate here at the Bookshop in terms of how we engage with people across discipline. It's always good to listen, and I guess one's art and our efforts to preserve culture is significantly experienced when we enter into portals of other disciplines, giving us options and chance that give more meaning to our actions. Thank you.
Great. And what about Lisa?
Yes, I agree with Kristian. Interdisciplinarity is essential, particularly because the activation of the material in our archives. We want to make that as accessible as possible to as many discipline experts as possible. So whether it's visual artists, academics, teachers, we love the fact that the activation of those materials can create innovation. We also love to convene conversations through our work, and much of that convening is about enabling creatives to engage with academics, and even within the subjects themselves, the participants themselves, many people would see their own practice as inherently interdisciplinary. So yes, I think it's very integral to the work that we do. I think it's also the sense of play, formal and informal, that I think interdisciplinary practice facilitates is very important. And it's also an honouring of the foundations of our work. So I mentioned Len Garrison, one of many key founders. And, you know, when you're creating something of a community movement, I'm sure many will relate to this. So many people wear different hats. You could be the photographer, as well as the writer, the poet, the organizer, the fundraiser. So yes.
And over to you, Görkem.
Yeah, yes, we work very interdisciplinarily. We work with artists from all sorts of art forms. And I think one of the main things that we try to focus on is really about trusting the artist and their own practice, their own background, and their lived experience, which gives them a perspective that differs from the mainstream. And we trust that this makes their work come from an authentic place, but we're not really focusing on that at all. So, you know, there's nothing worse than being asked, like this has happened to me, where people have said, oh, we want to work with someone, we want a Turkish woman, which is my background, and being asked to work with someone because of my Turkish background. We're not really interested in that. We're interested in people who have a lived experience of being racialized in the Australian context, but that's not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on the artist's own practice and their art forms.
Which is such an important point, because I think, you know, when we're talking about what diverse art is about, I think it's carving that space where you can tell a story regardless of the kind of burden of representation that the outside world puts upon you or expects you to perform a particular role or an ethnicity. So it's important that, you know, you're all carving out that space. I guess my next question, and I think, Lisa, you were starting to talk about that with one of your programs, you know, where you talk about embracing and championing different forms of diversity. The next question is around if you could elaborate a bit more on the process of engaging your main constituents in the making of preserving of art. You were mentioning, you know, there's just the scholars who go in the archives, but there's also all these other spaces where people can be engaged. So I guess the question is around, how do you engage your main constituents?
Okay, so when it comes to our collections are mainly paper-based materials. So we're talking about organizational papers, journals, newspapers, letters, etc. And we have some really phenomenal collections representing pivotal, transformative activism post-war from the Black community. So with that context, as well as the people who are researching our materials being a core constituency, so are the donors. So we really have a collaborative relationship with those people who have done the work and have decided as part of their legacy, they want to make it as accessible as possible. So how we manage that, we really ground that in our values. Our values are reflect, empower, ignite, disrupt, and champion. And within all that, there is a sense of of support and respect. So we listen to the passion and the kind of vision of the donors for how their work can serve the community, and we collaborate with them in how we frame and name those collections, and then how we create events and more engaging opportunities for people to encounter and be inspired and strengthened by that. So that's one way. We also we have that general approach to most of our collaborations, whether they are with universities that we partner with in the production of educational workshops or online educational tools, or indeed artists and organizations that collaborate with us to create really moving exhibitions. I hope that answers the question.
No, that's really interesting to hear more about the process. And I guess I would like to pose this question to Görkem next, because traditional theatre has a particular kind of audience. So are you kind of trying to break out of that mold in terms of thinking about your main constituents? Or how are you conceptualizing, your main constituents as well as your audience in your case?
Yeah, well, I think it's different in terms of how we engage with the artists that we work with. It's probably a different. I'll answer that one quickly first, if that's okay, about the artists. So working with, I think one of the strengths of our company is that because as I said, we privilege the work of artists from racialized or non-Anglo-Celtic backgrounds. We are very aware of the amount of artists that there are in Australia from those backgrounds. We don't have a Eurocentric idea of what is valuable in art, which unfortunately is quite common in Australia. It's a very Eurocentric notion of what is good and who is good enough to make art. We sort of have a very different view to that. So in that way, it's very easy, I suppose, to engage the artists that we work with, because we're coming from a place where we center those perspectives. In terms of audiences, I think it's really interesting for when we were a venue, our audiences were largely those people who, our local audiences, I suppose, because we were venue based. But now that we make work in the regional settings and we make work in locations that theatre people don't usually attend, we've got a much broader audience, and often people who don't go to theatre, and often people in the regions in Australia, those that would attend, a museum or a farmer's market or places like that. It does tend to be a more white audience, a more mainstream Australian audience, and so so I think we're making work. It's very different depending on where we are. So, but we are now making work where the audiences are themselves. Yeah.
Thank you. And Kristian, would you like to answer this question? I guess in the case of your bookshop, I'm guessing the local community is quite involved and engaged, but I'd like to also understand if through the other work that you do, like your poetry and your translation, who would you think of as the main constituents, in terms of the publishers, in terms of the audience, who is this work for, and who is your bookshop for?
Well, I think thank you for that question. I think I'd like to frame it with regards to how do we balance the commercial viability with the primary goal of art making or preservation. I think commerce will always be part of this network, but it is not the sole purpose. Our goal is to create a new ecology of art production and critical appreciation, where one gets the chance to change our biases against each other. So I can tell you that many of our translation projects were done to expand our sense of our language, that it's not something fossilized. It's not something that is captured in a particular special time. In the same manner that the indigenous people are not to be imagined as someone who is pure and untouched, but rather as agents. And this art process, these sculptural materials that we have been privileged to see and exhibit here in the bookshop is a testament to their being agents. So we have so many lessons that we can derive from our indigenous communities, and we at Savage Mind are deeply committed to this kind of work of engaging them. The bookshop model here is that we are not just here to sell books, but to get ourselves involved in the research, in the community outreach that will serve as future contents of new books that we wish to publish and distribute. Thank you.
That is so wonderful to hear in terms of, Indigenous culture and thinking of it as dynamic. I think we in Australia are in the middle of NAIDOC week, and with a very similar message around celebrating Indigenous culture, but not in a way that's about Indigenous people's agency, essentially. I also wanted to touch again on commercial viability, which was going to be my next question. So thank you for raising it. And I think, Lisa, you mentioned it as well in terms of the value of financial resilience. How does that work with Black cultural archives? How is financial resilience a reality, especially since you've been in operation since 1981? So you have done quite well on that front.
I think having the partnership of key institutional organizations has been key to our sustainability over the years. The demand for the space was made to a local borough council, and they were key in advocating for the importance of the mission of Black Cultural Archives. So Lambeth Council has been a key financial and strategic partner throughout the existence of Black Cultural Archives. But as the political waves have changed, have unfolded, funding also has changed, and the funding landscape right now is the most challenging it has been in my lifetime for cultural and arts organizations. There is no doesn't seem to be that much of a security blanket for organizations from the state. So it's important for organizations to be entrepreneurial, commercially savvy, and strategic about how to create meaningful partnerships with a range of organizations that can either provide direct financial support or strategic in-kind support to maintain the viability of an organization. So it's a hustle, is the bottom line. Black Cultural Archives, as you saw, has got a beautiful building, and we have spaces for meetings. We, in addition to doing our core work of managing a reading room for researchers and running educational workshops for a variety of students, we hire out the organization to different organizations, we run events and exhibitions, and we can charge fees for that. We also have an amazing bookshop, and so I'm so inspired by you, Kristian. There's so much more that can be done to activate that space. We have had the author talks, we have events around, the literature that's in that shop. And then in terms of our funding mix, it is mainly trusts and foundations that provide strategic grants. We obviously aim to have that over multiple years. Corporate partnerships, we've been lucky over the years, even though the DEI climate is changing, and that we're also starting to think about, looking forwards, how BCA fits within the conversation of ESG and the United Nations sustainability goals as well, that more companies are aligning with. And yeah, trying to engage as many supporters on the ground, which is something never to be overlooked. You know, people who can really partner and feel part of the movement by becoming regular givers of Black cultural archives.
Yeah, that's interesting, to hear about the funding climate, and there's certainly resonances in many parts of the world at the moment. Görkem, would you like to comment on this question?
Yeah, I just actually wanted to ask Lisa also, if having a venue, are you able to generate income from your venue in the work that you're doing, or not really?
Yes, so I mentioned hiring out our rooms,
Yeah.
and we have the bookstore inside the venue. We recently upgraded it to make it even more appealing and do merchandising around that. And then obviously our exhibition space, we host exhibitions there or events there, and we can charge a fee for that. And one thing I didn't mention, which is an area that we've yet to fully explore, is licensing of material, because of the complexity of copyright, particularly for an archive where many donations are from so many different people who stipulate rightly, how they want the material to be used. But as you can imagine, given the visibility we have, particularly if there's the interest in inclusive histories, we often get approached by publishers who are interested in leveraging the resources to create books, materials, finding a way around that is mutually beneficial is a big opportunity for us.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I just asked because, as I was saying earlier in my introduction, we found as an artist-led theatre company that having a venue enabled us to really generate quite a decent income for making the work. So by venue hire, we did have funding for an administrator when we were at the venue, so that allowed us to pay for that. So that's why I was sort of saying that I think every artist, every company in the arts company should have a venue or have a basic income, because once you have those two basic things, you can there's so much more you can focus on instead of being drained by the kind of trying to constantly get funding. So we made the conscious choice not to enmesh ourselves in ongoing administrative government funding. And that was viable when we did have a venue, so we could generate income. But now, without a venue, without being able to generate income, we do have to work project to project. So we have to get all the funding and partners, etc., for every new project that we're going to create. So that obviously is a very different model. No, it's not commercially viable at all. I don't know if theatre in Australia is commercially viable, but yeah, it's not a commercially viable enterprise. It really just works project by project, I suppose.
Yeah, and thank you for that response as well, because I think then there has to be space for that kind of work too, in theatre and even more broadly. So for the next, I guess, less than 15 minutes or so, I'd like to focus the conversation more on the broader impact of your work and of your initiatives. So maybe I'll start with Kristian on this question. Could you draw parallels between your work or your organization's work and that employed by similar initiatives worldwide? So you're aware of similar initiatives, whether it's in Southeast Asia or whether it's in other parts of the world where people that you're aware of are doing this kind of centering work around hubs like bookshops, and also doing the kind of content work that you're doing?
I know a particular novelist in Indonesia. The name is Ika Kurniawan, and we've been in contact, and we share similar experiences in terms of how we make use of our networks, of our global networks, and turning this into some capacity building and some publications like translations. Ika Kurniawan's short stories have been translated into Filipino, and he also has his own small publishing house like The Savage Mind, and through the National Book Development Board in the Philippines, it's the Philippine Book Authority. We're hoping that it's going to be the turn of Ika now to publish Filipino stories in Bahasa. So this kind of conversation, this kind of creative entrepreneurship, I must say, I have to invoke that word here, where people are not just limited to their being creatives, but they are also engaging, going into other frontiers. Like, for instance, Lisa and Görkem have been mentioning about how we try to navigate the rough waters. It's really a struggle. The struggle is real. But now, since we opened the Kamarin, which is an art space, I have also decided to produce some cocktail drinks based on some Filipino best-selling titles, some Filipino well-loved books. So we're toying the idea of, if you cannot read, at least drink now and read later. So all this kind of engagement we creatively do. And I'm quite glad that there's a new ecology where it's easier now for Filipinos and Southeast Asian writers to interact and connect. Yes.
That sounds like a wonderful creative and entrepreneurial exchange. I just wanted to quickly remind the audience that we're about 10 minutes away from questions. So do send your questions or put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible in the final 10 minutes of this conversation. Maybe I'll pose this question to Görkem. Do you feel that there are initiatives, similar initiatives in other parts of the world that you draw upon from time to time?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say, because I forgot to mention earlier, that I think that since we started our company, there are more and more companies in Australia now that are making work with diverse artists and perspectives, which is fantastic. And I think that in other settler colonial states like Australia, you know, countries like the US, Canada, New Zealand, I think there is definitely more companies that make work with you know, more diverse perspectives. So I think, yes, I think there are across the world. One company that I'd say is quite similar to us, although their context is very different, is called Chimera Productions in Paris. And they're really working with new perspectives through live experience to bring audiences in dialogue and examine some of the hard questions of global society, which is really what, you know, the work that we've been doing as well. And they're also working with a lot of artists from diverse backgrounds, a lot of migrants, and also the director themselves is from a racialized background. So I think that, yeah, there are companies in the world that are doing similar things. And I think the more, the better, especially in settler colonial places like Australia.
Yeah, that's right. I think settler colonies have particular problems, so it's good that, you know, this kind of work exists and it's growing. Lisa, what about you? Are there similar archives or archives of or Black cultural archives in other parts of the world that are comparable?
Certainly are, particularly across Europe. I've had the pleasure of meeting with some of the founders of said archives, whether it's the Netherlands, Sweden, Germany, comparative projects, not necessarily archives, in Italy, and then of course in the countries you associate with African diasporic presence, in America, Canada, and the Caribbean. So yes, and I think it's very important to have a global perspective, in able to compare and learn on issues of sustainability, but also importantly, community outreach and framing of the work as well to make it even more impactful, and also the policy conversation. I return to the fact that we are doing small p political work, which we haven't always made that explicit, in terms of wanting a world where everybody's history and culture is respected and connected with, as just part of our shared global story. So, you know, there's a huge opportunity to join hands with other similar organizations and work strategically together. We're doing that in some way within the United Kingdom. We have a project called the Black History Portal, where we're looking to consolidate archives within the UK that focus on important Black histories and make access to that much easier for, you know, not only a UK audience, but a global audience. And I have had tentative conversations with similar organizations internationally about doing something similar. So I think it's very important to be aware of who your contemporaries are across the world.
That does sound like a very dynamic space, and great collaborations to come. You've also sort of preempted what is going to be likely my final question to the three of you, which is around, I guess, the long-term impact of the work you're doing on your community, but also on the broader cultural landscape. So maybe I'll start with Kristian on this one. What do you think? How do you envision the long-term impact? Because obviously it's going to take some time to unfold, in terms of the local community, but also on the broader cultural landscape.
Well, we are quite optimistic with things. There's something about hope that keeps us doing this kind of thing that we do. And in terms of global connection, I mean, I've been privileged to experience some art residencies, and I take these opportunities of bringing these new learnings around the world and cultivate it in my local setting, in my local area. I think the idea of doing a network of entangled relationships among many creatives should be something that we should encourage. And this is something that, while we celebrate our identities, these identities are fluid and changing. Even our indigenous population are agents, and they are not just cultural tokens. And that is something new here in Bicol. And there are some resistance of this kind of thinking, of this savage mind way of this kind of thinking. But we will proceed, we will pursue. The inspiration, I said, is coming from this sense of hope, and the first revolution in Asia was led by a Filipino poet whose Numdiga is May Pag-asa, which means there is hope. And I would like to take always this inspiring story that sooner or later, whatever we do in terms of our advocacy, the arc of justice will bend towards us, no matter how long it may take.
That is a great note to end the final conversation. I mean, obviously, I want to hear from Görkem and Lisa, but from your end, I think that connection between poetry and revolution is a very, very hopeful note in these very dire times. Görkem, what would you like? How do you envision the long-term impact of, Metanoia and more broadly the work that you do?
I absolutely share Kristian's revolutionary notions. And I think the more arts companies and artists that share the principles that we hope to foster in our work of anti-racism, non-hierarchy, artist-centered, and privileging diversity, the better. I think that everywhere in the world we could do with those principles. And I think that artists often can create spaces where they are, where those things are happening. So I think in a more local sense, as the more mainstream and dominant theatre landscape around us changes, we feed its growth. And I know that, we've had the work has an impact on the artists we work with, and they go out and they work with many more companies and many more art places. One of the things that I think our company does is it empowers the artists. So a lot of older women that we've worked with from diverse backgrounds who say, we just stopped getting work. No one's employing us anymore. Younger artists, as I said earlier, that come out of training institutions or find that, they might be not able to get the same roles as some of their, Anglo-Celtic colleagues. Our work hopefully empowers these artists to go out and to make more work out there. So hopefully that has that impact.
That is also very empowering and very hopeful. Thank you, Görkem. And Lisa, I guess in your case as well, that you probably have seen some of the impact, because Black Cultural Archives has been around for, I guess, 4 decades, but how do you envision the future, given that the funding landscape has changed, but also that we live in slightly different times over in the UK, and it's slightly different connections with Europe and with the global South, and being the center of empire. What is the global? What is the future look like? But also, what do you think the future impact is going to be?
Well, I agree with what both Kristian and Görkem have said. The future is what we want it to be. We have to be involved in transformation, just like the founders did. It's like carrying that torch. It's a heavy one, but it's a critical one to continue. I think the history is showing us, the current history is showing us that we can't take these freedoms for granted. We can't take conversations on critical race theory, diversity and inclusion for granted. Histories of what different people, marginalized people, have done to make space for equity and equality, I think that history needs to be protected. So we have empowered those scholars historically, and I think now more than ever we have to continue doing that. Funding has been taken away from Black history scholarship in the United Kingdom, and it's a very scary trend if we look across the sea to what's happening in America about the shutting down of conversation. That's intentional, that is political. So I very much join hands with those voices of resistance to underline the importance of the knowledge and the culture that we steward. On a more personal and community level, I love talking about the fact that we have transformed individual lives. People come into Black Cultural Archives, they open this treasure trove, and they are inspired and empowered and transformed and activated about who they want to be in the world, whether that's going on to be a playwright, whether that's going on to be a scholar or a teacher. And we can lay claim to having empowered, lives out there and communities out there. So I really want to have us not undermine, yes, artists as well, but we have, for example, our current exhibitions and events manager joined us as a volunteer, then worked at front of house, welcoming guests here, then became an administrator, now is leading on exhibitions and events, and is also a curator outside of Black Cultural Archives. So we want to be a supportive, encouraging, safe space for people to fully realize their own ambitions, their full self-expression. And the last thing I want to emphasize is the importance of healing. This is challenging. These are challenging, violent times. You kind of alluded to it. It's peak out here, as the kids would say. So having a space where you can feel held, safe, supported, seen is critical. Being able to work through some of the trauma that history has created is really critical. So I would say healing is what I want to be able to celebrate, that we have facilitated space for, the pursuit of justice and self-expression, full self-expression.
Well, that's a really wonderful note and a heartwarming note to end the kind of the discussion part of this conversation on. I'd really like to open it to the audience now. I can only see one question in the chat, so I will read out that question. But I'd also really like everyone who's willing to turn their cameras on, because Diversity Arts Australia would like to take a screenshot and just see who's in the room and who's attending this talk. So if we can have a moment while I look at the question and read it out in a second, whoever's willing to, please, we'd really appreciate it if you can turn your cameras on. It gives a sense of embodiment to, I guess, a virtual conversation like this one. Thank you. I can see many people with their cameras on, and I'll
Is it
give,
okay if I take a few screenshots, everyone?
of course, okay with me, not speaking on anyone else's behalf.
Gly's is better at it than me. Thank you.
Okay, so I can see one question here from Omi, and I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Omi says, I'm at a place where I want professional creative practice to be nurtured in young people, but current opportunities indirectly exclude. In a regional context, where would you suggest I start in nurturing that? And I find aspiration isn't the problem, it's the lack of that carved out space. Any of you want to address that? By regional context, I'm guessing this is a regional Australian context. Is that correct? Okay. Görkem, do you want to take that maybe?
Well, I was just going to ask Umi if you wanted to just speak to it just a little bit more, just so we can understand a bit better, and then maybe.
Yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, so I'm actually from the UK, and I've lived in Australia for about 8 or 9 years in a regional area, involved in a lot of arts spaces. I'm chair of a regional arts board, and I just find that whatever the arts practice is, there's a lot of activities that are promoted by councils or arts organisations, but they're kind of designed in a way that exclude people from marginalised backgrounds, whether that's because, you know, you look at disability, you look at race, there's not an understanding that, for example, there's a 2-day acting workshop coming up in a location that is far away from, I suppose, the intended audience. Some of these young kids don't drive. It's a 40-minute drive. There's not a public bus that can take them there. It's 9 to 5, 2 straight days. And that kind of stuff doesn't get considered. And then it's also $75 to attend this workshop, which the organisers think, oh, well, that's really cheap, because if this was London or Sydney, where they've done these workshops, that's really cheap. Whereas I look at that and I said, you've immediately cut out 75% of the people that I work with through this arts organisation that would love the opportunity to practice some performance skills. And then even in the wording of how they promote things, it seems inaccessible to the people who might want the opportunity. It's kind of put up here as a creative practice, and it's, you know, I think it's scary for people who aren't in that space, because we're in a regional area. They're starting from zero, and that understanding is never appreciated. So I kind of, you know, I don't have unlimited funds I love the venue-based stuff, but where to start with that kind of thing, or you can carve out that space just to even move the needle.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, Görkem, you can go first if you'd like.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly, but I want to talk more about it. I mean, I feel like so am I understanding correctly that you actually you work for an arts organization and you can set up programs, or you work with young people, is that right? And
so I've worked in the education space, community space, performing, writing, all sorts of things. So I can deliver things, but there's actually not that space, the environment to do that without spending a lot of money, basically.
Yeah, and I mean, to me it seems like maybe do you have the opportunity to maybe set up some programs if you partnered with some organizations that could support you and the work that you're doing to do the thing that you know is necessary in the way that it's necessary, because obviously you know how it needs to be done and these other organizations don't. So maybe is that a possibility?
Yeah, it's just, I suppose, a big undertaking for individuals to do, but it ends up being an individual like myself, or someone from the Aboriginal community, or someone from the Sikh community that does that kind of thing. But we get all of these things that travel regional areas to share this stuff, and they consistently do this kind of thing where we're not consulted, so it's not like I can give that advice until after the fact, but it is a continual thing, and it's kind of where to start, because you're kind of following something that's already designed in a difficult way, and it's kind of the horse is already bolted situation. So, but we do apply for grants and things when we can.
Yeah, also maybe connecting with bodies that could advocate on your behalf. So for example, I don't know if are you connected with the regional arts organization of whichever state you're in? I don't know if that's useful. It might not be.
That's the one of the board that I'm a chair of is a regional arts
yes,
organization. Yeah.
Lisa or Kristian, did you have thoughts? It's hard because you're not in Australia. It's probably a different context. Maybe.
It's access to power and influence that you need. So understanding those structures and finding people who can advocate for you, bring you into the conversation, because otherwise you're just dealing with the effect. So it is about advocacy strategy. Yeah. And then, you know, the necessary work of networking and reaching out to people. It's unavoidable. Being brought into WhatsApp groups of other leaders, having conversation with politicians, and directly with a wider range of funders. These are just the strategies, the kind of actions that come to mind. But yeah, it's always got to be relevant to your context, which I don't fully understand. But yeah, I think being bold in seeking that influence and power is what is needed, because you're clearly somebody who understands the needs of the community that you're trying to serve. And it sounds like you're the best person.
And I think I will add on to that is the exhaustion that comes with, if I take a step back, then nothing happens, but that's not a speed that I can run consistently. Yeah.
And so those networks are not just about influence, but also care and support for you, like to re-energize. Again, which is challenging in this time where they're cutting funding left, right, and centre. But you know, solutions do come out of those conversations where you're brave enough to say what you need. So yeah, my best wishes for you in that pursuit. I am hopeful for you.
Thank you, Lisa, for those wise words, and probably need us. I want this conversation to continue and to gather some more wisdom and strategies from all of you. But it does have to conclude because we're just past 7:30. I do want to add that there is a survey from Diversity Arts Australia that they'd like all of the attendees to fill out, just because it gives us a bit of feedback on this talk and helps to plan future sessions. It is anonymous, it's in the chat now, and it only takes a minute to fill out. So we'd really appreciate if you can do that. To wrap up, I would really like to thank the organizing team and our wonderful panelists. It's rare to have people from 3 very diverse contexts, but also so deeply connected to, you know, anti-racism and creativity, and how the two are deeply entangled and have been from the word go, poetry and revolution, as you said, Kristian. So I'd like to wrap up on that note, and thank you everyone for attending.